911, what's your emergency?
Hi, yeah, I'm just calling because I heard some strange noise next door.
What's your address, sir?
It's, 6 Drive.
Oakwood was a small and quiet town, where nothing ever seemed to happen. But on the night of August 5, 2022, everything changed. What started as a simple noise complaint, turned into a mysterious death investigation that would baffle the Oakwood Police Department for years. It all started when the neighbors of a middle-aged man named Jacob Simley reported hearing loud noises coming from his house. The police arrived at the scene and found Mr. Simley lying unconscious on the floor of his living room, with blood on his head. The forensic team immediately went to work, collecting evidence and trying to determine what had happened to Mr. Simley. The initial hypothesis was that he had been attacked and hit on the head with a blunt object. Mr. Simley was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, he did not survive his injuries. The police were now faced with a murder investigation, with a number of potential suspects to consider. The police began by interviewing Mr. Simley's neighbors, who reported hearing the noises coming from his house. They were able to provide some valuable information, but nothing that could definitively identify a suspect. The first person of interest was the victim's ex-boyfriend, David. The two had recently broken up and David was reportedly upset about the split. He had a history of abusive behavior and had been known to follow the victim around. When questioned, David denied any involvement in the crime and claimed that he had been out of town at the time of the murder. However, several witnesses had reported seeing him in the area around the time of the crime. Additionally, David's alibi was weak and he had no explanation for why he was in the area. Despite this, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime and he was eventually cleared as a suspect. The second person of interest was the victim's co-worker, Emily. Emily had been in a romantic relationship with the victim and had reportedly been jealous of Simley's other relationships. When questioned, Emily denied any involvement in the crime and claimed that she had been out of town at the time of the murder. However, several witnesses had reported seeing her in the area around the time of the crime. Additionally, Emily's alibi was weak and she had no explanation for why she was in the area. Despite this, there was no physical evidence linking her to the crime and she was eventually cleared as a suspect. The third person of interest was a man named Mark. Mark had a criminal record and had been seen in the area around the time of the murder. When questioned, Mark initially denied any involvement in the crime. However, upon further questioning, he admitted to being in the area at the time of the murder. He claimed that he had been looking for his lost dog and had stumbled upon the crime scene. Despite his admission, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime and he was eventually cleared as a suspect. The forensic team continued to examine the crime scene, looking for any clues or evidence that might help them solve the case. But as the days went by, it became increasingly clear that this was not going to be an easy case to crack. The police had a number of potential suspects to consider, but no clear motive or evidence to connect any of them to the crime. The investigation was at a standstill, and the people of Oakwood were beginning to fear that this was a killer that would never be caught. As the investigation into the death of Jacob Simley continued, the Oakwood Police Department found themselves with more questions than answers. There were no clear leads or suspects, and the forensic evidence was inconclusive. The detectives working on the case were frustrated and exhausted. They had interviewed dozens of people, but none of them had provided any valuable information. It seemed like they were at a dead end. But then, one of the detectives noticed something strange about the evidence they had collected. There was a small piece of fabric found at the crime scene that didn't seem to belong to anyone involved in the case. The detective decided to have the fabric analyzed, and what they found was shocking. The fabric was not from any known brand or material, and it had traces of a rare chemical that was only used in a few industrial applications. This new evidence was a breakthrough in the case. The detectives began to look into companies and industries that use this chemical, hoping to find a connection to the murder. After weeks of investigating, the detectives finally found a lead. They discovered that one of the employees at a local chemical plant had been fired around the same time as the murder, and he had a history of violence and aggression. The detectives obtained security footage from the chemical plant, which showed the suspect, Eric Wiles, leaving work on the night of the murder. They also found his DNA at the crime scene, which was the final piece of evidence they needed to make an arrest. With the suspect in custody, the police were finally able to piece together what had happened on the night of August 5, 2022. It was a case of mistaken identity, and the suspect had attacked Jacob Simley, thinking he was someone else. The victim's family was devastated by the news, but they were relieved to finally have closure. The suspect was charged with second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The community of Oakwood was deeply affected by the tragic death of Jacob Simley. He was a well-respected member of the community, and his death had left a void that would never be filled. But despite the pain and grief, the community also found strength in each other. Jacob's family and friends came together to remember him, to share their stories and memories of him. The police officers who had worked on the case were also present at the memorial service. They had grown close to Jacob's family during the investigation, and they wanted to show their support. Jacob's wife was quoted saying, "Without this team's dedication, they may never have found the truth." The lead detective on the case was quoted saying, "Solving cases like Jacob's was more than just a job, it was about providing closure and peace of mind for the families left behind." After years behind bars, the man convicted of Jacob Simley's murder was released from prison. The truth behind the case had come to light, and it turned out that he was not guilty of the crime. It all started with a bizarre discovery. A front door camera captured Eric urinating on the victim's house, which was how his DNA was found at the crime scene. But upon further investigation, it was revealed that the man had simply stumbled upon the scene and had nothing to do with the murder. It was a shocking turn of events, and the real killer was still at large. The victim's family was devastated once again. Eric was released from prison, a free man once again. The detectives went back to the drawing board, determined to find the true culprit and bring them to justice. As the detective reviewed the case one final time, something caught his eye. A witness had reported seeing a tortoise in the area where Jacob was found. It was an odd detail, but the detective knew that sometimes the smallest things could lead to big breakthroughs in a case. The detective sent the tortoise shell fragments to the lab for analysis, hoping to find some answers. The lab results were shocking. The tortoise shell fragments had traces of Jacob's DNA on them. It was then that the detective realized what had really happened. Jacob hadn't been murdered after all, he had simply slipped on a tortoise, fallen and hit his head, causing his death. The detective went to visit Jacob's wife to give her the news. She was shocked and relieved all at once, grateful to have an answer after so many years of uncertainty. The lead detective was quoted saying, "I felt a mix of emotions. I was relieved to have solved the case, but also saddened by the tragedy of Jacob's accidental death." The case of Jacob Simley's death had been a challenging one for the Oakwood Police Department, but in the end, they had found the truth. While the outcome may not have been what they expected, it was still a resolution that brought closure to Jacob's family and friends. If you enjoyed today's authentic, absolutely true, 100% real, definitely not AI-generated true crime story, please feel free to like, subscribe and leave a comment.